Welcome all to the official start of phase 2. I'm the Sustainability Director for the town of Acton, and I'll be shortly introducing the rest of the team here today. Thank you. So please use the raise hand feature if you would like to speak, and wait for the facilitator to give you the floor. Share your name and video if able. Use the chat for additional questions and comments. And please mute yourself when you're not speaking, so everyone has the ability to unmute themselves. But we would love to keep the background noise to a minimum as much as possible. And there will be a section for questions and answers both in the middle of our presentation and at the end. So at this meeting, we plan to review the CAP phase 1 accomplishments, so the blueprint, introduce the climate action planning effort for phase 2, and then finally break out into groups to gather feedback on evaluation criteria for phase 2 analysis. Next, please. So many of you know Julie Curdy and Van Du from MAPC. If you've been a part of the process before, I do see a lot of new faces. So MAPC helped us a ton with our first phase and our climate action plan blueprint. They're continuing to support on phase 2 with community engagement. And then we have our new team members from ERG, which will be helping us with the technical assessments and cost benefit analysis of each strategy. So we have Charles Goodhue, who's a project manager for ERG, Hannah Stroud, who's a deputy project manager, and John Carter, who's a technical lead. So you all can just wave your hands to the crowd so people know who you are. Great, so next, please. So since June, we've been collecting input through a community-wide survey, which received 386 responses. We led 13 different events, including advisory group meetings, the Climate Action Plan open house, thematic group meetings focused around nature-based solutions, buildings, and energy and mobility. And that finally led to development of the Climate Action Plan blueprint, which we published in December. And we also published it in January in simplified Chinese. And then right now we're here on the 3rd phase of this timeline, and we're developing the final climate action plan. And there's a lot of people to thank as part of this first phase in the development of the climate action plan blueprint. There's Kate Crosby from the Acton-Boxborough Regional School District, who worked really closely with Resource Force student team at Acton-Boxborough High to lead their own climate action plan process. And we've included their input in the blueprint. There's also the Green Advisory Board, the Acton Committee for Housing and Climate, the Acton Climate Coalition, Green Acton, the town manager, and many department heads, and so many more. And this list is not exhaustive by any means. So you'll find a long list of acknowledgements in the blueprint. And so after all of this work, we're going to celebrate in June 11th. So mark your calendars. In the afternoon at Nara Park at the amphitheater, we'll be celebrating the climate action plan being published. And so now I'll pass it on to Van, who's going to do a bit of a deeper recap of phase 1.
Great, thank you, Andrea. Hi, everyone. Really good to see many familiar faces again, and welcome to all the new folks joining us. I'll just quickly give a refresher of what we've done so far, which was in phase 1, which was last summer and fall. And so first we had many community meetings, meeting with folks, whether one-on-one or in focus groups or at to figure out the priorities. What are some of the priorities to be included as part of the climate action planning for the town of Acton? We walked through goal setting, and then from there we looked at developing strategies, actions to support those goals. And then we went through an exercise of evaluation and prioritization of those strategies as well. Keep in mind that evaluation process was brought kind of high level for us to help consolidate, compile, and kind of streamline all of your great ideas that you've given us. And then we produced for phase one, this blueprint document that listed all the goals and the strategies, some of the examples, and kind of some planning context and setting the next step for what we now is in phase two. We also established some guiding principles here, centering equity, making sure it's a robust and inclusive community engagement process to make sure that all the voices that have been participating before, have not, are at the table, hearing all the different priorities and perspectives in town. Thinking again of the climate emergency declaration that you have as kind of part of our foundation to move forward, thinking about goals and strategies. And then thinking cross-cutting issues such as public health, resilience, affordable housing, biodiversity, all of these major kind of we've heard from you as concerns or opportunities or, you know, kind of priorities that you want to be considered as we move forward with that goal and strategy development. And also thinking again of, you know, what can Acton do, and also what can Acton influence in terms of at the regional and state level. And so thinking of that systems change as well. And of course, celebrating the unique histories and characteristics that make Acton home for many of you, all of you. So again, just a quick recap on the community engagement. I think we did between 25 to 30 some sort of total events, whether it was one-on-one stakeholder interviews with community organizations in town, as well as with department staff to really get the different perspectives and understanding of what has been going on, as well as what do you want, your visions of what should be happening next. So we started out with the select board presentation to set to kick off the phase one meeting. Actually, we did a survey which we received somewhere in the 400s, I recall. In terms of, again, letting kind of communities an avenue to provide their input. We had advisory group meetings with experts in towns, as well as kind of key stakeholder organizations that kind of help steer the process. We also have thematic workshops, so we broke into building and energies theme, nature-based solutions, and mobility, so kind of break it down a little bit so that we had more time for those conversations within those topics. We actually also had student from the Boxborough, Acton Boxborough High Regional School as well, that helped kind of facilitate that conversation with their fellow students in the fall. We had an open house at Narrow Park. It was really good to see many of you, even though behind a mask, in person, just to do that prioritization process with the sticky dots, if you recall. And then, yeah, so we went through quite a robust kind of process and meeting with focus group, having focus group with the renters as well, just to kind of make sure there's the space and places for all of the perspective, again, that we want to hear from the community. And I won't go through each of the goals and strategies here, but again, we did produce the blueprint document that listed all the goals as well as the strategies this is based on what we've heard from the community. So I encourage you, if you haven't, check out the document, but this is also a great foundation for us to move into this next phase as well. This is where we'll, the continuation of this climate planning work. So back to you, Andrea.
Great, thank you, Van. So before we dive into the Climate Action Plan Phase 2, we want to provide a little more context on some of the criteria we will be reviewing to assess the strategies, specifically when it comes to resilience. So I'm going to briefly run through some definitions. So mitigation are actions to reduce emissions that cause climate change. So examples include cleaning the energy in our grid, electrifying our homes and buildings, for example, to phase away from fossil fuels for heating and cooling, improving our energy efficiency and cutting our energy use. Examples of adaptation include actions to manage the risks of climate change impacts. So every 5 years, the town does a hazard mitigation plan or a municipal vulnerability preparedness plan. And we're actually in the process of starting the hazard mitigation planning process right now, where we address a lot of these adaptation targets. So examples include things like making sure our key buildings have energy, emergency generators in case of like an energy outage, or storm resistant windows, like the ones that are installed at the public safety facility. Actually, those are hurricane resistant windows. And examples of resilience are what's right in the middle of the Venn diagram. So the official definition of climate resilience is the ability of a community to address the needs of its built, social, and natural environment in order to anticipate, cope with, and rebound stronger from events and trends related to climate change hazards, including temperature changes, extreme weather, coastal and inland flooding, changes in precipitation, and other impacts. So the key here is the words cope with and rebound stronger. So it's not just about responding to climate change, but it's about building better. So a really good example of a resilience strategy is our wetlands protection. So we have a wetlands protection bylaw and regulation. So this helps protect us against flooding, but it also helps with sequestering carbon and brings all sorts of other benefits to biodiversity. So that's a really good example of a resilience strategy. Next, please. So our top hazards in Acton, according to our hazard mitigation plan, are flooding, severe storms, and extreme temperatures. So when we look at these strategies from a resilience lens, we can also think about how they can help us cope with some of these hazards. Annual temperatures are rising and the frequency of extreme heat is increasing. So this is an example how these changes will be experienced here in Acton. Heat waves increase risk of heat-related deaths and illnesses and stress infrastructure. Higher average temperatures have significant impact on ecosystems, biodiversity, and crop production, as well as increased likelihood of infectious diseases spread by insects. Extreme temperatures can also result in more demand for energy required to, for example, heat and cool our, in this case, cool our homes, schools, and workplaces, which can increase cost and emissions. Next, please. So when we think about resilience, it's also important to look at Acton's community profile. So climate vulnerable populations are those who have lower adaptive capacity or higher exposure and sensitivity to climate hazards like flooding or heat stress due to factors such as access to transportation, income level, disability, racial inequity, health status, or age. So we don't have all of those factors in this profile, but we do have age shown here. We have race and ethnicity, as well as whether or not the population is made up of renters or is owner occupied. So here in Acton, over 25% of the population is considered a renter. And so renters face unique challenges when it comes to things like getting an energy efficiency audit. So there are unique challenges faced in that sector. Looking at things like where does our low-income population live? And then race and ethnicity does play a really important role here in Acton because of our environmental justice zones. So next, please. So in Acton, our environmental justice areas are shown in yellow. So that's where minorities comprise 40% or more of the population. And so in the legend, you'll see a ton of other ways that the state defines environmental justice. So you'll see income, English isolation, and in Acton, the state defines the portions of Acton as for minority. This is not to say that there aren't issues with income or English isolation. It's just to say that in terms of meeting the state threshold, in Acton, we're looking at populations based on minority. So environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So in Acton, it means ensuring that the benefits of climate action and our resiliency measures accrue to all, which is also stated in our climate emergency declaration. So next, please. So our climate emergency declaration was passed at a special town meeting in 2020. And it specifically calls on town government and staff and all Acton civic groups, businesses, and residents to commit to a climate mobilization effort with appropriate support from the state and federal governments to bring net town-wide carbon emissions to zero as quickly as possible with a target date of 2030. So how we're defining net zero today. We're defining it as reducing the community's greenhouse gas emission as much as possible and removing or offsetting any remaining emissions by the target date of 2030 as identified in the climate emergency declaration. So this will require a major shift in the way we heat or cool our homes, how we get around, and where our energy comes from. It also presents an opportunity to change our community for the better, because by achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions, we can also have other benefits like the ones shown in the Venn diagram before, things like cleaner air, healthier people, and a more equitable and prosperous community for everyone. And so now I'll pass it on to our new team, ERG, to walk us through phase 2 of the Climate Action Plan.
Thank you, Andrea. Hi, everyone. My name is John Carter. I'm a senior engineer with Eastern Research Group, or ERG, and I'm going to be leading some of the mitigation analysis and greenhouse gas forecasting work that we'll be doing throughout this project. We're really excited to share with you our overview of the process and steps that we'll be taking through phase 2. And also excited to hear from you today. As we move into breakout sessions, we'll be able to discuss some of the strategies that may exist already and how we can best prioritize those going forward using certain criteria. It's really important to have you all engaged here today and moving forward. As you may know, the municipal operations of the town of Acton only account for about 5% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the town. That means the other 95% are coming from businesses, residents, industry within town limits, and really are outside of the direct control of the town's government. So reducing those emissions is really incumbent upon the engagement and activity and buy-in from all the town's residents, businesses, and other stakeholders. So again, we're really excited to share this with you today and get the process going into phase 2. Next slide, please, Van. So our first task is going to be to prioritize the strategies that were developed and put out in the blueprint document. That document included dozens of actions across 5 different categories of emissions. And we're going to try to further group those into similar strategies of like actions and really focus in on about 15 or so of those strategies for a detailed analysis that will guide us through the climate action plan process and help us reach that goal of net zero by 2030. So part of what we want to hear from you today is how those criteria should be weighted and to make sure our list of criteria for this first qualitative ranking are being used. We realized that there was some of this qualitative ranking done for the blueprint document. We are going to tap upon that and use that. It won't go unused. But we want to make sure that in our next steps, as we take a deeper dive, that we are looking at the right criteria for evaluating those things. This is just an example table of how we might do that, and some of the criteria that are listed here are shown on the next slide as well. Please, Van. So this is, again, just a draft list, things to consider. Some of these were included in the analysis for the blueprint document, things like the greenhouse gas reduction potential, total cost, social equity considerations, and some of the barriers to implementation were already addressed. There's a few additional items here, and again, we want to hear from you about anything that are any other items that are important to you, and then how these things might rank in importance to you. Next slide, please. As we are doing this qualitative ranking of strategies to really hone in on the strategies that we'll be doing a deep quantitative analysis of, we'll also be creating a forecast of future greenhouse gas emissions. This is also known as a business as usual scenario of how emissions may grow as the town grows over time, because your 2030 net zero goal is not based on your emissions in 2019 when the greenhouse gas inventory was completed. It's what your emissions are going to look like in 2030, which are likely going to be more. So we'll generate this forecast using growth factors, or perhaps just a single growth factor like population. If we have a forecast of future population or business growth or vehicle miles traveled, these things can be applied to certain sectors of emissions to show how they may grow over time. This particular graph is an example from a different municipality, but it shows how the different emissions in various categories can grow over time, sometimes very dramatically. This will provide the basis for our analysis going forward, like I said, as we do our quantitative analysis and show how all these things reduce emissions to work towards that 2030 net zero goal. Next slide, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Charles Goodhue.
Great. Thank you so much, John. Thank you, everybody, for your time this afternoon. My name is Charles Goodhue. I'm an economist with ERG out of Lexington, Massachusetts. Also, have lived in Middlesex County just about my whole life. So very excited to be working as part of this phase 2 project. And I'll be leading a lot of the benefit cost and economics work associated with this phase. So as John said, after we prioritize some strategies for further analysis, part of it, in addition to the greenhouse gas reduction estimates that John will be leading, will be looking at the benefits and costs of each strategy. And the benefits can include both financial costs or financial benefits, so what will be paid out of pocket, and maybe cost savings, such as maybe fuel switching leads to cheaper prices in some situations. So that would be a financial cost savings example. But it can also include other non-market benefits. Certainly, many strategies will reduce criteria air pollutants like particulate matter, nitrous oxides, sulfur dioxide, and that helps with health impacts associated with asthma and cancer. So there are some strategies that we typically use to try to put a dollar value on that based on the reduced health impacts. So that's something we'll try to capture as part of these benefits. And then there's there are ways to monetize or put a dollar value on the reduced carbon dioxide emissions. And we typically do this as a range. Sometimes we look at the market value. So if there's a carbon trading market, for example, we might do this as a lower end of a range. And then in previous work, we've typically looked at more what they call the social cost of carbon, which is a fuller accounting of the benefits of reducing CO2 that might include sort of climate change impacts associated with reducing carbon dioxide. So that's something we will look at. And we will try to separate out all of these benefits so that it's very clear what's financial and out of pocket and what might be, again, more health related and what might be more environmentally related with carbon dioxide. So we recently did some work for the state of Maine, where we looked at various strategies to reduce greenhouse gases. And in their context, which will certainly be different than Acton's, tried to look at some of the assumptions, some of the costs, and cost effectiveness, so that the dollars per metric ton reduced of their strategies, to help inform the decision-making framework. I'll say that economics alone is not the lone criteria. This is really to provide context to how much things might cost. Sometimes it's used to look at, well, how much does this cost compared to maybe getting a renewable energy credit or finding another way of achieving a similar reduction. So just because something's lower on the list doesn't mean it wouldn't necessarily be prioritized. It just means that's what the benefit cost shows. There's going to be other co-benefits that might not be able to be monetized. There are going to be equity issues. There's going to be all the other criteria that John put. So this is just one piece of the puzzle that we'll be doing as part of this work. Next slide, please, Van. Just to provide a little bit more context for the rest of the project, once we do the technical analyses, both the greenhouse gas reductions and the benefit cost analysis, we'll be looking to just show how these could be rolled together into potential recommendations, looking at some actionable steps, potentially some key partners and stakeholders that could be part of those steps. So we're very much interested in learning along the way, and taking advantage of these meetings to help inform that step. And then we'll be developing graphs and charts to support the development of these strategies with the climate action plan. So we might have visualizations from the greenhouse gas reduction. Here's sort of an example of a type of visualization you might see, visualizing key results, maybe something like the previous slide where we try to show the benefit cost on a scale of different strategies. And then Vanta, I think my final slide. I also wanted to provide some context of the community engagement steps. So this first meeting, which is part of this phase 2 technical analysis, is again to introduce our team, just provide some more context about what we will be doing in the coming months. And we will be having a meeting later in March where we'll be presenting the prioritized list of strategies for in-depth analysis. So that'll be our next meeting. We will be busy at work in the beginning and mid and early parts of the end of April to perform that greenhouse gas reduction analysis and benefit cost analysis, task 1.2 and 1.3 that John and I just showed, to show what those results are looking like and take comment on and questions on what we've done and what those results look like. And then finally, we'll have a final meeting in late May to show sort of a final presentation of all the work done in phase 2. So I will pause there for questions.
So the first question is from Jim, and I'm gonna lump both of your questions, Jim. So for benefits and cost analysis, are we considering the town's costs and benefits, or residents' costs and benefits, or residents plus business owners, or what? And the second one is, how will you be analyzing costs and benefits of the strategies that involve influencing federal and state action? We do know that we can't make this work without a lot of federal and state support. I will say that I'd say for the first phase, it's looking at the hard dollar value. So looking at the financial and other benefits that Charles mentioned, like health, but where that payment comes from, I think will be a discussion further down the process. So first we have to get those numbers, if that makes sense. And then Deborah asked, what will be used to estimate town population growth, especially given recent projections have not borne out? And I'll throw that one out to ERG. Actually, I'll throw all of these out to ERG. So the second one is, will financial analysis of strategy/technology be life cycle and operations based? And 3, will cost benefit analysis include value of opportunity costs when action is deferred/delayed?
I'll take that first one related to population growth. That's something that we're going to have to work closely with the town with to see what type of growth factors are available and whether or not we think they're accurate. If you're saying that recent population estimates have not borne out, then we may want to consider other items that are applicable to specific sectors of emissions. Population is usually the one that is generally applicable to all sectors of emissions. As Andrea showed earlier on one of her slides, there's a per capita emission calculation that's already been done as part of the greenhouse gas inventory. So the simple way would be to say, if nothing changes, but population does, what are the resulting emissions based on that population change over time? And that's kind of your business as usual or do nothing scenario. But again, it's just a forecast. We want to make it as accurate as possible. It will certainly be updated anytime the emissions inventory is updated or the climate action plan is updated in the future. Along those lines, these documents and this work is not intended to sit on a shelf and just stay as is for the next 10 years or so. It needs to be updated with some frequency so that new technologies, new information can all be taken into account, and the plan is adjusted over time to make sure that the goal is met.
And I think I can take that second question and probably the third one as well. Will financial analysis of strategies, technologies be life cycle plus operations based? And yes, we want to include capital costs, operation costs, if there's clear disposal costs and costs up front, anything that we can easily get data for, we want to include in those costs. The one thing I'll say here too, though, is that we're providing some context about how the results will be used and thinking about what really moves the needle. We don't want to spend all our resources figuring out if something's $35 per metric ton or 37.3 or 39.2. We want to make sure that we focus on taking on more strategies and providing some good context, reasonable ranges to really help understand that. This is going to be less an academic, very extremely precise, and more of a informative, practical understanding what we can do, monetize what we can monetize, but make sure we discuss anything that we can't put a dollar value on so that can be considered as well, because there will certainly be co-benefits. That's a great question. And then the cost benefit analysis include value of opportunity cost when action is deferred, delayed. This is a really good question because again, delaying all strategies as a whole will certainly have impacts. And this can certainly be something considered. I think one purpose of the benefit cost analysis going back there is to have a sense of how these strategies might compare to each other just from that criteria of benefit cost analysis. And in that sense, the delay is going to be rather similar across the strategies. If we don't do this strategy that reduces by X metric tons, it's going to be similar to this strategy that doesn't reduce it by this metric ton. So if we can put them on the same platform, we can still use those numbers effectively there. But I think the story about the opportunity cost is something that we'd certainly want to put out and consider in the framing of the results, because that is a really important part of this. And it's a really good point and question.
Thank you, Charles. And we are officially a minute over time before we go into our breakout groups, but I'll Jim was building on his other question. So he did say, for example, switching to an EV costs a family upfront, but most EVs come with significantly lower operating costs. So how do we assess the cost of switching to EVs?
And I would just say there, we can look at capital plus operations and look at it over the entire lifetime, so that we kind of sort of say over 10 years, this is your cost, as opposed to this is your upfront cost.
Thank you. Great. I think we're ready to move on to our breakout groups. These are our discussion guidelines. Please mute yourself when not speaking. Whenever possible, refrain from multitasking on email or social media, and strive to remain fully present. I know how difficult that can be. Please assume best intent in everyone's comments and strive to keep a constructive tone in your own. Use simple, accessible language and avoid jargon and undefined acronyms. There's a lot of those in climate action speak, so keep that in mind. When speaking, make just one point and then let others speak. We want everyone to have an equal chance to speak. And finally, use oops, ouch, sorry, and sidebar. We're all trying to learn and grow from our conversation. If something wrong was said, acknowledge it, apologize it, and or flag it to a facilitator on the private chat sidebar. And with that, Julie notes that there will be an ERG staff person in each breakout room that can help answer additional technical questions. So with that, I think we'll start splitting up.